All right, guys, how's it going? This is obviously definitely different than what we're normally doing on a Wednesday night. But just to update you on everything, in case you haven't heard yet, until April 6th, we're not going to be having our normal services, whether that be Wednesday night, Sunday, whatever it might be. Also, any events, not just for the youth group, for the church, they're going to be put on hold at least until that day. Then we're going to kind of decide what we're going to do going forward from there. But in the meantime, myself, for our Wednesday night, we're going to continue going through our Knowing Jesus series, because one of the reasons I was excited about doing this one now was it would lead us right up to Easter Sunday. So kind of getting into knowing different aspects, different characteristics of Jesus, looking at his life, going through the Gospels, all that leading up to Easter. And I was really looking forward to how that was going to work. Obviously, we won't be doing that together on Wednesday nights, but through these videos, we're still going to be able to stay on track with that lesson series. Also, Sunday morning services, Sunday evening services, and the adult Wednesday night classes are also going to be recorded and uploaded online. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So for tonight, the lesson that we're doing in our Knowing Jesus series is Knowing Jesus as Messiah. All right, so last week was our first week in the new series, and we started of knowing Jesus as God. And we were able to go through and look at all these different characteristics of Jesus and see how he isn't just the Son of God, but he also is God, right? We know that he is the Son when it comes to the Trinity. You have God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But also, that doesn't mean that Jesus is any less God than God the Father. So just to kind of recap what we talked about this lesson series being is last week we did Jesus as God. Today we're going to be doing Jesus as Messiah. Next week is Jesus as the Creator. And then week 4 is going to be Jesus becoming human. And all of that kind of coming together to kind of give us a really good idea of who Jesus is. And I think it's going to be a really cool way to lead right into the celebration of Easter. So tonight we're going to be looking at Jesus as Messiah. Okay, just a real quick definition. Our Word of Life definition that's given for us as Messiah is anointed or chosen one. All right, and we can go through, and we're actually going to go through a handful of Old Testament passages and how they relate to the New Testament passages. But there's a ton of different passages in the Old Testament that talk about the Messiah that's going to come. And basically what we're going to be doing tonight is looking at those, looking at how Jesus fulfilled them in the New Testament, and using all that to kind of come to the conclusion that Jesus is the one true Messiah. All right, so the first point that we're going to be looking at is we're going to be examining signs. All right, signs that Jesus is the Messiah. And there's going to be two major points that we're going to be covering. The first one, again, being examining signs. And then the second is examining science. All right, examining science and seeing how we can come to the conclusion that Jesus is the one true Messiah. All right, so when we're talking about signs, what we're really talking about is the messianic prophecies throughout the Old Testament. All these different prophecies that were given, not in just one particular book in the Old Testament. We're going to see as we go through a couple of them how there were all kinds of prophecies talking about the Messiah that was going to come and details that went into those prophecies. And we kind of touched on some of this back around Christmas time when we were looking at the prophecies of Jesus, how he was going to be born, where, to whom he was going to be born to, all those different details that we kind of went through around Christmas time. Some of it might seem familiar when we're looking at it from this standpoint, but that's what we mean when we say signs. All right, so the first signs that we're going to talk about is signs about the Messiah's family tree. Okay, signs about the Messiah's family tree. Now, we're not going to read through it all because it can seem kind of tedious, but in Matthew chapter 1, we can see the family tree, the genealogy of Jesus. All right, so it's important to understand why that's important, right? So the genealogy of Jesus' family that we see in Matthew chapter 1 really shows us all the way back to Abraham, how we can see all throughout the family line, leading all the way to Joseph, who was, again, the adopted father of Jesus. So to kind of summarize what that chapter really covers, it records 42 different generations, all right, spanning from, again, Abraham all the way up to Joseph. And so in the Old Testament, several of these ancestors of Jesus that you can find in Matthew chapter 1, and if you want, you can go through and actually read through that yourself. It's going to be a lot of this guy beget this guy, and it's just going to go down the line like that, of saying this guy was this guy's father, all the way down to Joseph, all right? But several of the men that you see in that genealogy were prophesied to be in the line of the Messiah, if you go back through. And so just to give you a quick handful of verses, there's going to be a lot of verses as we go through the lesson for today. So if you want to maybe write these down as we go along, again, we're not going to go to all these different passages. There's going to be a couple that we do go to, but if you want to write them down as we go along, I definitely encourage you to do that. So just to give a handful of references of people in that ancestry of Jesus that were prophesied to be in the line of the Messiah, you have Abraham is mentioned in Genesis 12, chapter 3, Isaac, Genesis 26, verses 3 and 4, Jacob in Genesis 35, verses 11 and 12, Judah in Genesis 49, verse 10, Jesse in Isaiah 11:1, and King David in 2 Samuel 7, verse 12. All right, and you can see all these different men mentioned in this line of ancestors of Jesus if you go into Matthew chapter 1. But if you want to and you have some time, again, I encourage you to go back and look at those different passages, because really what we're going to come to the conclusion of today is we can see here in the Old Testament this was prophesied, and we can see here in the Old Testament how this prophecy was fulfilled through Jesus. And all of that is going to point to the fact that Jesus is the one true Messiah. So that's just to kind of give a quick overview of signs of the family tree of the Messiah. All right. So the second group of signs that we're going to look at, and we're going to go a little bit into more detail, is signs about the birth of the Messiah. All right. Signs about the birth of the Messiah. So here's where we're going to start to get into a lot of different verses, and Old Testament versus New Testament. And for each one of these, I'm going to give the Old Testament passage and the New Testament passage. I'm going to say basically what these two verses are talking about. And then I'm also going to give about the time that was between when it was prophesied and when it was fulfilled. All right. So the first thing that you can kind of see about the birth of Messiah is in Micah 5, verse 2. That's where it's prophesied of where he's going to be born. And this is actually one of the passages that we covered back around Christmas time when we were looking at prophecies of Jesus' birth and then seeing how they were fulfilled. So again, these are some of the passages that I said might be familiar to us. But Micah 5 and verse 2, we see where he's going to be born. We all know that he was born in Bethlehem. But in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, is where we see that passage fulfilled. Now, the space between these two passages of when they were written, or from when it was prophesied to when it was fulfilled, is about 700 years. And that's about, there's a couple that are more than 700 years, but the majority of what we're going to look at, there's about 700 years between the time that it was prophesied to when it was fulfilled. Okay. The second sign about the birth of the Messiah that we see prophesied and fulfilled is we see something about his mother. Now, in the Old Testament, it doesn't say that it's going to be Mary and say specifically who it is, but we kind of see what is unique about the mother of Jesus. And we know that Mary was a virgin. All right, again, these are, when it comes to the birth of the Messiah, a lot of these verses are what we talked about around Christmas. But in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, here's where we kind of see the prophecy of what is the mother of Jesus going to be like. And then in Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 23 is when we see that fulfilled. Okay, and again, there's about 700 years between those two. All right, and so now that's the two examples of the signs about the Messiah's birth. Now we're going to go into a lot more different verses about signs about the Messiah's life. All right, so different details about him, about what he was going to be like, things that he was going to do, things that were going to happen during his life. All right, so there's two different kind of passages when we see about what the Messiah would be called or what his name would be. And two passages in the Old Testament that kind of talk about that are Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. Isaiah 9 verse 6, and also Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. And then in the New Testament, we kind of see those two passages fulfilled in Luke chapter 1, verses 30 through 33, and Matthew chapter 1, verses 22 through 23. All right. And again, the time difference there was about 700 years. So now this next part, I kind of want to go into a little bit more detail. This is some of the passages that we're actually going to turn to. So the next thing that we're going to see is, what would the Messiah do? So once he's come, once he's born, he's on the earth, what are some of the things that we read that he's going to do? Okay. So the first passage that we're going to turn to is Isaiah chapter 35. Isaiah chapter 35 and verses 5 through 6. It says in Isaiah chapter 35 verses 5 and 6, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out and streams in the desert." So here, if we were to just kind of summarize what's being talked about here, it's kind of talking about the miracles that the Messiah would perform. All right, we know that the Messiah is coming. These are some of the miracles. These are some of the works that he's going to do while he's here. Okay, and there's a few different passages where we can go and see each one of those specific miracles performed. We're going to turn to one of them, but the three passages are Luke chapter 18, verses 35 through 43, Matthew chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, and then the passage we're turning to is Mark chapter 7, and we're going to read verses 32 through 35. So Mark chapter 7, verses 32 through 35. It says there, "And they bring unto him one that was deaf, and had an impediment in his speech. And they beseech him to put his hand upon him. And he took him aside from the multitude, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spit and touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed, and saith unto him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And straightway his ears were opened, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain." So this is a man that was deaf and was also dumb, or wasn't able to speak. All right. So here's where we see back to, again, in Isaiah chapter 35, talking about how the deaf would hear, the dumb would speak. These are prophecies of specific miracles that the Messiah would do, that Jesus is specifically fulfilling. And if you were with us around Christmas time and you remember back to some of the things we were talking about, one of the things that we talked about what a prophecy is, what's a prophecy like, all right? It's more than just a prediction. And one of the things that we compared it to is when we turn on the news, or we go online and we see what's today's weather supposed to be like, or what's the weather going to be like in a week. Those are all predictions. Now, as we get more technology, it's supposed to be more accurate. There's supposed to be all these different tools and mechanisms that are able to measure all these different things and say, okay, based on all these pieces of data we've collected, this is what the weather is supposed to be like tomorrow or next week. We all know that it's not really all that accurate. But again, those are just predictions based on, well, this is kind of what we feel it's going to be like based on how everything's going right now. So that's more of a prediction. Now, prophecy is something that is much more specific. All right. Now, I could say that it's going to rain tomorrow, and that's not a very specific prophecy. You know, I'm not saying that it's going to rain, it's going to be a torrential downpour. I'm not saying it's going to sprinkle, but if there's any kind of precipitation that happens tomorrow, if it rains even a little bit, I was right. All right. But these prophecies, as we go through, we can see that they're so detailed and they're so specific that for something, or for somebody to actually fulfill that prophecy, is much more impressive than me predicting what the weather is going to be like tomorrow. All right. So that's kind of some of the things that we went into, and we went into a lot more detail than just that when we talked about what's the difference between a prophecy and a prediction. All right. And so as we go and look at some of these different passages, and you take time to go over some of these ones that we're not going to be going to specifically together, you're going to be able to see that there's a lot of detail in these prophecies. It's not just saying sometime down the road, there's going to be this guy and he's going to do some things. All right. We just read in Isaiah 35, he's going to do all these great miracles. He's going to cause lame to walk, deaf to hear, dumb to speak. And we just saw that he made a deaf and dumb man hear and speak. All right. Those are really specific details. And every one of these different prophecies we're going to look at, and that's referenced here, is just another detail on the list. And all these details together make it that much more miraculous and that much more obvious that Jesus is the Messiah that we read about in the Old Testament. All right. So the next sign about the Messiah's life would be about his arrival. And we can see that prophesied in Zechariah 9, verse 9. And it's how he's going to arrive, specifically kind of arriving in the city before he goes and dies on the cross, right? We celebrate Palm Sunday, and we kind of are referencing when he comes into the city riding on a donkey, right? And that's something that we see prophesied here. And then we see it fulfilled in Luke chapter 19, verses 35 through 37. Now, the distance between that prophecy and when it was fulfilled was a little bit less. It was still 500 years ago. So it wasn't the 700, but 500 years, still a long amount of time. If I were to prophesy something that's going to happen 500 years from now, and I get it right, that would be pretty impressive. All right. So the next thing is how he would be received. How would the Messiah be received? And really, again, referencing to what we celebrate with Palm Sunday, we know he was received really well then, but in the grand scheme of things, when you look at Jesus and his earthly ministry, he really wasn't all that well received by a lot of different people. A lot of people were critical of him. A lot of people were claiming that he was blasphemous because he claimed to be God. There's all these different groups of people, the Pharisees, even people who weren't really the religious elite, if you want to call them that, but kind of wanted to follow those people. They said, well, the Pharisees, they're the religious leaders, we should be following them. So then they didn't really like Jesus all that much. There are all kinds of people who are really critical of Jesus. And so in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, we see that he's not going to be welcomed very well, right? People aren't going to like him. People are really going to even kind of hate him, right? And then we see in John chapter 1, verse 11, we see kind of talking about how when Jesus is going to come, and when he does come, that his own received him not, right? So that's John chapter 1, verse 11. And that gap is 700 years as well. So the next two aspects of the Messiah's life we're actually going to turn to, and we're going to read those passages because they're really relevant with the time of Easter that's coming up. So the first passage that we're going to turn to is Psalm chapter 41. Psalm chapter 41, and we're going to read verse 9. It says there, "Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." So this is really talking about Judas, right? It doesn't mention his name here, but it's talking about a friend, somebody who's close to him is going to betray him. Now us, the group of us now as Christians today who have the benefit of looking at the New Testament, we can read that and say that's talking about Judas. And that's what we're going to turn to right now. We're going to turn to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26 and verses 47 through 50. Matthew 26 verses 47 through 50. Says, "And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he that betrayed him gave him a sign, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Hold him fast. And forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. And Jesus said unto him, Friend, wherefore art thou come? Then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him." So we're seeing that prophecy fulfilled. Now, one of the things I kind of want to draw attention to, aside from Jesus referring to Judas as friend, Judas approaches Jesus and says, Hail, Master, and then he kissed him. All right, and Judas is, again, one of those examples of somebody in the Bible when we read and we look to and we read, you walked with Jesus, right? You spent time with him one-on-one. You spent time with him, following him around, seeing all the great things that he did. And he even called him master to his face and kissed him. But the kiss was to signify, this is the guy that you're looking for, and he was arrested. And we look and we say, how could somebody do that to Jesus? Especially somebody who's walking with him each and every day. But that's kind of something that we do in our lives, right? We come to church and we worship him in times of worship. We read through the Bible when it comes time for the sermon. We talk about how we should be sharing Jesus with people. We talk about how we should be supporting missionaries. And we talk about how much we love Jesus, and we tell people that we love Jesus. But then we go out and we sin knowing that we're sinning, knowing that we're going directly against what Jesus and God want for us. Really, we're doing the exact same thing that Judas was doing. It's pretty much a slap in the face of saying, I love you. You've done all these things for me. Jesus was pouring into Judas's life for all the time that he was doing his ministry on earth. And then Judas repays him like this. All right. We do a lot of the same thing. So yet when we look at Judas like that, let's kind of be careful when we find ourselves being critical of Judas, right? Because we might not be doing the exact same thing that Judas is doing, but a lot of times the way that we live our lives is like what Judas was doing, really just kind of turning our back on Jesus and really spitting in his face. All right. And so the second thing that we're going to look at when it comes to specifically Judas's betrayal is looking back to Zechariah chapter 11. All right. Zechariah chapter 11 and verses 12 through 13. It says, And I said unto them, If ye think good, give me my price. If not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, Cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized at of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Now that 30 pieces of silver, when we think of the story of the gospel, that sounds very familiar, right? So again, we're going to go back to the Gospel of Matthew. And for that, we're going to be in chapter 26 once again. But we're going to go to the beginning of the chapter, and it's verses 14 through 16. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests and said unto them, What will ye give me? And I will deliver him unto you. And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. And from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. So that's where we see the 30 pieces of silver mentioned again. All right, now it says in verse 16, and from that point he sought opportunity to betray him. That 30 pieces of silver, that was enough for him to betray his master. Remember, even later in this chapter, he says to him, he says, Hail, right? He says, Hail, Master. And that's how he refers to him as he's betraying him. And that 30 pieces of silver was all it took for him to betray him. All right. So again, I want us to kind of think about what are things that, we betrayed Jesus for, that we turn our back on God for. It could just be, well, I don't want to go to church tonight because I want to go do this with my friends. That's something that we could be doing some other time, right? It could be something so little as, well, I'm going to go up to the park, play basketball with my friends. That's all it took for me to say, sorry, Jesus, I'll hang out with you later, right? And we're just kind of turning our back on God, knowing that we should be coming to church, spending time with fellow Christians here, going into the Word, encouraging each other. But it can be something so simple that just draws us away from that. To where really we're starting to elevate that above what we value Jesus at. So again, as we look at this specific story of Judas and his betrayal of Jesus, let's kind of pump the brakes a little bit when it comes to our judgment of him and saying, how could he do that? Because again, we might not be doing the exact same thing, but a lot of times we were betraying Jesus just like he did. All right. And so the fourth sign about the Messiah that we're going to talk about is signs about the death of the Messiah. All right. And first detail about the death of the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6, we see details about how his beard is going to be ripped out. Okay. We see that fulfilled in Matthew 26 verse 67, and that's about 700 years later. In Isaiah chapter 53 verse 7, we see that he's going to stay silent, that he's not going to say a word, he's not going to put up a fight. As we read through the story of the gospel of what Jesus went through, even leading up to the cross, you might be reading through it and saying, why wouldn't he just stop them? Why wouldn't he just, he spoke the entire universe into existence, right? He could easily just say one word and all of that would have ended. But in Isaiah 53:7, it says that he's going to stay silent. And in Matthew 27, verses 12 to 14, we see that fulfilled. All right. And then we also see in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 12, we see that he's going to be kind of grouped together with legitimate criminals. Okay. And in Mark chapter 15, verse 7, we see him kind of standing alongside Barnabas, right? Barnabas was this murderer. He was this horrible person, right? And basically the choice was given to the people. Do you want Barnabas or do you want Jesus released to you? And they said that they wanted Barnabas to be released to him. And we also know that Jesus, he also hung on the cross next to two criminals. All right. So we see he's going to be grouped together with legitimate transgressors, legitimate people who deserve the punishment that they were taking. All right. And then the fourth passage couple passages we're going to turn to is Psalm chapter 22. Psalm chapter 22 and verse 16 says, "For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." All right. And in John chapter 19 and verse 18, it says, "Where they crucified him and two other with him, on either side one, and Jesus in the midst. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross." All right, so it's kind of drawing attention back to him being on the cross. Well, how did they get him on the cross? We know that they nailed him through his hands and his feet. All right, and so this idea of Jesus being on the cross, we see the details of how he's going to be pierced through his hands and his feet. This was written 1,000 years before it came to fruition, before it was fulfilled. All right, so that's just one more detail, one more specific detail about the death of the Messiah that was foretold in this instance 1,000 years before it happened, and another detail coming to light. All right, and then the final one in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10, we see another example of how he's going to be pierced. Okay, and then in John 19:34, it talks about how they pierced him through his side, and blood and water came out. They had done that to make sure that he was dead. All right, and that was about 500 years after it was prophesied. So all those examples that we went through, right? Signs about his family tree, signs about his birth, signs about his life, and signs about his death. All those different details, all right? And we didn't even look at all of them. We kind of mentioned some of them in passing. And again, I encourage you to go through the ones we didn't have time to turn to. But finally, to kind of close this all up, we're going to examine the science. Now, when I say the science, I'm talking about the probability of all this happening and being fulfilled by one person. All right, so before we kind of talk about that, I'm going to talk about a couple different things and just the probability, the chances of these different things happening to you. So the chances of you being struck by lightning are 1 in 114,195. So that's your chance of being struck by lightning. You have a 1 in 4 trillion chance of your house being hit by a meteor. So that's kind of good news that we don't have to really worry about our house being hit by a meteor. If we do, we have a story that nobody else could tell. Those are a couple examples. Another one, the odds of winning the Powerball jackpot, 1 in 292 million. The odds of getting attacked by a shark are 1 in 3,748,067. All right, so the odds are better there than getting hit by a meteor, but still pretty insurmountable odds. All right. The odds of falling to your death are 1 in 119. So that's a lot more likely to happen, but I still don't think it's something we should be too concerned about and trying to watch out for. But when we look and see what are the odds that one man, one person fulfills all the different prophecies in the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament are all fulfilled by one person. All right, we can easily find 48 different messianic prophecies recorded in Scripture that have been fulfilled by Jesus. All right, and again, these aren't just like super surface level prophecies of he's going to have brown hair or something like that, right? We went through some of the details, and you can go through and read through them all again, all the different details. the odds of one person fulfilling all those prophecies are almost, or essentially, you can't quantify it. You can't figure it out. And that's how great the odds are. And actually, we have a better chance of being struck by lightning, being attacked by a shark, and being hit by a meteor all at the same time than the chances of one man fulfilling all those prophecies. But we can see that one man, Jesus, fulfilled all those different prophecies. So when we look at it in that aspect, when we see that it's very obvious that the Jesus we read about in the Gospels is the Messiah that was prophesied in the Old Testament, it should be simple for us to come to the conclusion that this is the guy that was foretold. He is the Messiah. And so if we can believe in him and see that he fulfilled all these prophecies, we can then believe that those prophecies are true. We can then believe that the other promises that he gives us are true. Like the promise that he's going to save us if we put our faith and trust in him. The promise that we're going to one day spend eternity with him. So that's kind of what I want us to pull away from this and take with us is and this is kind of the conclusion that we came to back in December when we looked at the prophecies about his birth. If we can look and see that he was faithful in staying true to these prophecies, he'll be faithful and true in staying in the promises that he's given us since those prophecies were fulfilled, and the other prophecies that we know will continue to be fulfilled. We can trust in him, and we know that he is the only one. So that's the encouragement that I wanted to bring to you guys today, especially in the crazy times that we have going on right now. Let's just think about, we have that one Messiah, that one true Messiah, the one true God on our side that we can go to and look to for hope. We can go and look to for peace and comfort in uncertain times that we're going through right now. So if anybody is kind of confused about what's going on, doesn't really know what to expect going forward, I would say just continue to look to Jesus, continue to look to him, just to give you that peace and that hope that even if you know everything around you is going crazy, which right now it seems it is, we still have that one steady factor in our life, and that is Jesus. So I wanted to bring that little bit of encouragement to you guys. Be looking out for the other 2 lessons in this lesson series coming up within the next couple of weeks. We're going to be posting those. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. I encourage you to share these videos as well with your friends so that the message is being able to get out to those different people, and be using that connection that you have with your friends, even though it might not be in person, to point them towards Jesus, right? If these times are uncertain for us as followers of Christ even, think about somebody who doesn't have Christ, who doesn't have that hope and that peace, all right? We can use this time, even though it's difficult, to help point others towards Christ. So let's try and do that as we go throughout these next few weeks, and hopefully we get to see you guys soon.